Ladies and gentlemen, it's that time once again where the wee gamers in Bunker Club come and annoy your visual pleasure with another video. I'm going to be the sidekick this time because this is Justin's fanboy moment as Johnathan Green joins us. I'm not going to list his accolades because if I sat here and listed everything that he has been the author of, well, that would be time for us to go home. Instead, we shall talk about these things after Justin has asked his questions, of which there are 6. And here's how Justin told us there were 6. He said it like this. He said, I've got 6 questions. And with that, I give you Mr. Green and wee Justin.
6 there are, no more, no less. 6 shall be the number of the count, and the number of the count shall be 6. Well, Jonathan, it's good to have you here with us tonight. And like Andy said, we won't go into everything, but if you very quickly want to give us a very quick overview of everything you've been involved with, not just fighting fantasy, which you can see behind me here, and you're the hero. So go for it. Tell us a very quick history of yourself and Gamebooks.
Okay. Well, I was 10 years old when The Warlock of Fartup Mountain, the first fighting fantasy game book, was published. And I was hooked straight away. I'd never seen anything like it. I'd never read anything like it. I'd never seen illustrations in a kid's book like it before. And from that point, I guess it was inevitable that I would want to write a game book myself. But it took about 10 years. So it was when I finished school, I wrote to Puffin saying, how do I go about writing a game book? And they could have ignored my letter, but they forwarded it to Mark Gascoigne, who was the consultant editor on the line at the time. And he very kindly wrote back and told me what to do. And I just remember the letter ended with the line, but I should warn you, your chance of being published is very slim. But it didn't put me off. And about 2 years, 2 ideas, and at least 3 rewrites later, I got my commission for my first book, which is Spellbreaker, which is just on the shelf I can see behind you there. Yeah, and from there onwards, I'm fortunate to say that I've been published every year since. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, that classic text on the front. Yes. A fantastic cover by Alan Langford, which I think was his first cover, possibly first and only cover for fighting fantasy, actually, because he did illustrated books like Island of the Lizard King. But yeah, so from there I became one of the regular writers. So I was having 1 book published a year until Puffin Books cancelled the line. So the series ended with Puffin with one of mine, which was Curse of the Mummy. But then 10 years later, they were brought back by Wizard Books. And by that point, I was in touch with Stephen and myself. And I was asked to write Blood Bones, which is on the end of your shelf. And I'd written that for Puffin, but it hadn't been published. Yeah, the other side, that's the one.
The other side.
So that eventually came out, I think it was in 2006, having been written in 1996. And I then wrote several more original titles for Wizard Books, the last of which is on the other end, which is Night of the Necromancer. Yep. And that one begins where all the others end, in that you're killed on your way home and you come back as a ghost and you have to solve your own murder. Nice. But because of that, I was then quite heavily involved in fighting fantasy. And while Wizard Books were talking about what they wanted to do next, it was coming up to the 30th anniversary. And I kept saying, look, why don't we do something to mark it? It could be a trilogy of books. I pitched all sorts of ideas. I had an origin story for the Warlock of Fartup Mountain, and all of which they said, no, thank you. And I said, well, what about... I then actually wrote an article for SFX magazine about the history of fighting fantasy, thinking I knew a lot, and in writing it realised I didn't know anything. And also it just grew in the telling. So something I think been commissioned for about 2,000 or 3,000 words was published at about 7,000 words, and that just scraped the surface. So I then said to Wizard, why don't we do a coffee table book? And they said, great idea, too expensive. And it was then that somebody said to me, have you heard of Kickstarter? So I think it was about 2 months after Kickstarter actually started in the UK, I crowdfunded You Are the Hero, and have now done a second title following that up. But in the interim, because I've done game books, I've also written game books for Doctor Who, Star Wars, Sonic the Hedgehog, which I co-wrote with Mark Gascoigne when I was living in Nottingham.
Justin, you were going to mention it.
I think that's probably one, may not get a mention, but there you go.
Whenever we were talking about your bio, where he's written a Sonic the Hedgehog book, and just goes, I don't think.
Yeah, no, they were a lot of fun. A lot of fun. We had some real puntastic sessions trying to work out things for that. The one that sticks in my mind is Foggy Froggy the Fog Frog. But anyway, I didn't reach those heights again. That's all I'll say.
I'm not going to try and say that.
All right.
But I've also I've written game books for Games Workshop. They briefly did a line. They only published 4 of them, but 2 of them were mine. One was 40K, which was Herald of Oblivion, which was later turned into an app by Tin Man Games, and Shadows over Sylvania, in which you were a vampire. So you got to fight what people who are normally perceived as the good guys. You got to fight the Empire. You also got to fight other undead and demonic cults and goblins and all sorts of things. So that was great fun to write. And yeah, should mention, of course, that since 2015, I've been writing my own series, which is now called ACE Gamebooks. So the first one was Alice's Nightmare in Wonderland, and I'm currently writing number 6, which is Dracula, Curse of the Vampire. So they're all classics reimagined as game books with my own twist or spin on things.
So it's very...
So that's me in game books in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's very varied. Everything from Sonic to 40K. I mean, they're 2 things you don't normally get in the same sort of collection. But
no, I'm just going to say the Sonic one. It was I co-wrote them with Mark, and Mark was the Sonic expert because he'd co-written some novels, but he wrote them with, I think it was at least 2 other people, and they used one pseudonym which I can't remember now. So he was well versed in Sonic lore, and he was very good at puns and jokes. So I was there to kind of provide the game book structure. We plotted it together. I wrote it. He then came along and polished it, made sure everything was working. So it was a good collaboration, but written in very, very quick turnaround as well.
The link, of course, is that Sonic the Hedgehog is blue and that ultramarines are blue. And there's your 40K link to Sonic the Hedgehog.
There you go, yeah.
The most tenuous thing ever.
Just before Justin kicks off with his questions, as any good biographer would, let's just, for the audience's benefit, make a quote from Jonathan's own wiki. And he hasn't written this, remember. Green's books are reputed to be among the most difficult in fighting fantasy due to the frequent inclusion of high-level adversaries, because there is often little room for error. For instance, in Bloodbones, it features a final battle against the skill 12, stamina 24 adversary while suffering a -1 strength attack penalty. It goes on. I would point out there is a Fighting Fantasy t-shirt which is available to be bought, and it says Fighting Fantasy, stamina 12, skill 12, stamina 24, -1 attack. And now we know that.
Yeah, I like to think that there were 2 authors called Johnathan Green who write Fighting Fantasy game books. One wrote the Puffin books, and then there was this weird changeover period where he kind of co-wrote one with the Bloodbones book for Wizards, and then there's me who's written them since, because I did learn a lot from my mistakes. And when I first got online and read people's comments, and it was the first time I'd really had any feedback from readers saying what worked and what didn't, and it was just that, I think, the arrogance of youth. When I wrote them, I cheated at the books. I didn't roll the dice. So I was trying to look at ways to beat people like myself, forgetting that what you should really do is write the book fairly for someone who wants to play fairly. Because if someone wants to cheat, they probably just want to read the story, and it's a compliment. So I like to think I'm a much fairer game book designer now.
I don't know.
Can I just ask,
Your Honor,
how many bookmarks did you use when you were reading any of the other game books? Because I used to run out of fingers between pages.
Oh yeah, the classic.
No, I don't want to go there.
The 5-finger bookmark, definitely. Yeah.
You see,
I did have little torn up bits of paper.
That was the first, for me, that was the first version of saves in a role-playing game. A digital role-playing game. Save it there, I'll play on a bit. Oh, that's good too, I'll save it there. Anyway.
That's me in Skyrim all over.
Well, listen, my normal 6 questions, I usually start with tell us a bit about yourself and then how did you get into gaming. We've kind of covered those, so I'm going to jump ahead to really quite an interesting one, which now I was talking to Andy before we started tonight that we've spoke to game designers, we've spoke to people who publish games and so on. We haven't actually spoke to somebody who's been involved in game books before. So one of my questions is normally tell us about your creative process. So this is going to be interesting actually to hear about the creative process of how a game book gets put together. So can you enlighten us on how that, I just imagine it's sort of like a flow chart of different sort of go here, yes, no, go this way, yes, no. Is it any way like that at all? Or
yes.
What can you tell us?
I've refined my process over the years. So generally I'll have the idea for the book, the premise, whether that's adapting an existing work or an original story of my own. And I just brainstorm in a notepad. I still do it by hand. I scribble down maps, notes, ideas. When I first started out, for example, Bloodbones is pirates and voodoo. So I was doing any cliche to do with pirates and voodoo. With Fighting Fantasy, I'd always try and use a monster that had appeared in Out of the Pit, the monster manual, but hadn't actually appeared in the books yet. So I also tried to fit something to the setting. Now it's possibly slightly more sophisticated because obviously, for example, in adapting Alice in Wonderland, you've got to have certain characters and hit certain beats, but then you can play with expectations as well. So I've got some Victorian urban myths in my edition, which all tie into the original story. So I start off with my planner, and from there I generally draw a really basic flow chart, and I normally like to have 3 or 4 acts. So Act 1, you discover what the problem is. Act 2, you go looking for the items or whatever it might be, and Act 3 is the final, the end game with the dramatic fight at the end. So it could be as basic as a piece of paper with maybe 12 interconnected boxes, and that's it. But then when I come to actually write it, I will divide those down again by scenes, and these days I now do a very detailed flow chart before I even start writing. And in the writing process, it may change, but it doesn't change massively. And it does make it a lot easier when it comes to editing and also trying to make sure that your sections are on a nice round number. Because I know there are game books which end on, for example, 363. But for me, for the ACE Gamebooks, it's got to be at least 500. And I couldn't bear to write sort of 898. I'd have to write 900. So it helps you resolve problems like that as well.
There's always a bit of OCD in every gamer somewhere. So.
Yes. But I know one of the things that other authors often ask me is, how on earth do you write a game book? I wouldn't know where to begin. But as my wife would attest, I'm incredibly indecisive. So if I was writing a story, I'd want to say, well, what if they went there? But I'd also like them to go here. So in a game book, you can do both. So you could have the swamp and the forest. It doesn't have to be an either or. That's up to the reader to decide at the end. So that makes it a lot easier when you think about it in those terms. So once I've plotted it out, I'll then write it. I know different people do the whole muddling up numbered sections in a different way. I write mine in order. So number 1 will go to number 2 and 3 and so on. And obviously it gets slightly more complicated than that. And then at the end, only once I've proofread that and edited it will I then muddle everything up. And I know people say, what software do you use? And I don't. I do it old school. I do it by hand. There's probably quicker, more efficient ways, but it's how I've always worked. And for me, it's part of the process. And the great thing about writing the book in order is it always gives you an idea of how much you've got left. So you're not suddenly running out of steam, or if you need to add a scene or cut something, you can see as you're going along. So once I've muddled everything up, I then send it off to, so by this point it's been edited, it's been proofread, I've muddled it up, I then let somebody else see it. So now my ACE Gamebooks have a team of very good proofreaders and play testers who will go through and find all the mistakes that I left in on purpose, obviously, to make sure they're doing their job properly. And once their feedback comes in, I get some lovely feedback which says, oh, I love this is great, blah, blah, blah. But the ones I like are saying, you've got an extra apostrophe here. This section number should turn to that. If you've gone this way, you wouldn't have this item. They're the perfect ones. The most critical ones are the most helpful. So the more ruthlessly it's been play tested and proofread, the better the finished product will be. So once I've then got the final version together, I always print it out again, proofread it again, and eventually I'll send it to the publisher to be laid out. And along the way, I've obviously commissioned an artist as well to produce the illustrations, because for me, game books have to be illustrated. It's how they've always been, and it's how I would always want mine to be as well. So we put the whole lot together at the end, and then you end up with something that hopefully looks good as well as reads well.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously quite a bit in there. I would imagine that you probably actually would be writing it like a novel and then sort of chopping it up as you go. So from what you're saying, you kind of write it in sequence. So yeah,
yes,
it sounds probably the easiest, most simple way to do that. Actually, just write the story you want to
generally
write and then break it up.
Yeah, generally, it's become more complicated now, because a lot of my ACE Gamebooks you can play as more than one character, and often stories intersect. So, for example, Neverland Here Be Monsters, which is Peter Pan meets Jurassic Park. That one, all of the characters' stories start and end in slightly different places, but they all intersect at various points. So if you're playing as Peter Pan, you meet Captain Hook and chop off his hand, but you can also play as Captain Hook, where you meet Peter Pan and get your hand chopped off. So they all intermesh. And they'll have different unique paths as well. But what I found was when I was writing it, rather than write one person's story, I still wrote them all pretty much simultaneously, up to certain points that obviously have to break off, but so that I was always at roughly the same point in the story. So when I came to write the climax, it was the climax for everybody. I wasn't going back and later putting something in, because I wouldn't want to waste time writing something and then do it from another person's point of view and think, oh, well, this has got to happen for this to make sense, or, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this had happened, because everything was kept tied up together at the same time. But sometimes I'll leave, partly to make sure that I get to a nice round number, I'll leave certain scenes, or there'll be some sort of subplot which I'll leave to the end, which I can then say, well, I've got 12 sections left, so that's going to be a 12-section scene to fit it in. Yeah. But otherwise, generally, it all sticks quite closely together.
So tell me this, what is next for yourself? What, are you working on anything new at the minute, or are you finishing anything off at the minute that's going to be with us soon?
At the moment, I'm frantically finishing off, I suppose in a way it's my first role-playing game, because although game books are role-playing games of a type, they're obviously solo play, but it's based on my last published ACE Gamebook, which is 'Twas the Krampus Night Before Christmas, and that's based very loosely on Clement Clarkmore's poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, which starts 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. So in that, the character, it never specifies that you're a child or an adult, so it could be either, but people have assumed that you're a child because you're in your dressing gown. You do the whole adventure in dressing gown, slippers and pyjamas. But you wake up on Christmas Eve when you hear a thud downstairs and the clock strikes 13, and you investigate and you find that Krampus, the Christmas devil, has abducted Father Christmas while he was visiting your house, and you have to save him. And it's possibly a lot darker and more mature than the premise might suggest. There's lots of Christmas legends and myths in there from Iceland and Europe and Italy as well. So places, all sorts of places which have gone into the mix. So I'm now writing or finishing off a role-playing game based on that. So the premise is similar in that the party play the part of a group of toys that are brought to life by Father Christmas's magic. But again, you've got all sorts of different toys that have their own abilities, but you're fighting imps, fire sprites, wolves even at one point, animated snowmen. The artwork is by Tony Huff, which I might have to my right, actually. So Tony is an artist. You might. He's recently had some work published in War Gods of Olympus, has come out. But he and I have collaborated in the past before on some fighting fantasy game books. And so I don't know if you can see that against the reflection, but there's an animated Christmas tree with sort of a Christmas fairy character who's Perkta, which is a mythological sort of sprite. There's a sinister Jack Frost at the window.
Brilliant. Oh yeah.
So it's quite beautifully detailed work, but it's quite dark because Tony's very good at doing the weird and gruesome. So those are the Yule lads from Icelandic mythology. There's 13 of them, 13 trolls, and they live with a giantess and her giant husband. There's the snowmen. So
sweet.
that probably gives you an idea of the tone.
I said it earlier that you cover everything
And
from Sonic to 40K to Christmas stories to Jurassic Park to Peter Pan. You've done a massive, well varied range of stuff in your writing,
yes,
and it's fantastic. It must be. I mean, do you ever get stuck for ideas? Because it looks
no,
like you
that's
cover everything.
I honestly have more ideas than I'll ever have time to write already, I would say. Just with the whole game book, the ACE Gamebooks premise was didn't really start off as a series. It was just, I wanted to do a game book based on Alice in Wonderland, and it was coming up to the 150th anniversary of the publication of the original book, and I thought, perfect time to do it. And then people started saying, well, are you going to do a sequel through the Looking Glass? And it's like, well, no, because that's in the first book. Then I thought, what else could I do? So I did Wizard of Oz, I've done Peter Pan. Then I did Beowulf, which was one I'd actually been thinking about for a long time. So that's Beowulf Beast Slayer, so you are Beowulf. And I brought in elements of Old English, Anglo-Saxon, there are runes in there, there's kennings from Viking poetry. And so that's quite a different tone again, but it was illustrated by Russ Nicholson, which is amazing.
Brilliant.
There we go. There's the book there.
I'm going to give you a wee sort of segue here to sort of the game book day that
Yes.
you're involved with. Right. Tell us a wee bit about that. What's going to be happening at it? Who's going to be there? Just anything you can give us, any info at all you can give us on it.
Okay, well, it's happening on Thursday, the 27th of August, from midnight to midnight. So, because the idea was it is meant to be international. So there are people in the States who are probably going to be posting things in the early hours for us in the UK. Then there are people in Australia and New Zealand as well. But during the day in the UK, from about 12 till 5, Ollie Mack, who does the Story Masters Tales, which are kind of card game, board game, role-playing game book genre hybrid. It's amazing. He's interviewing a whole lot of game book luminaries. So we've got Jamie Thompson, fans. He was in too many other game book series to mention it, particularly of him and Dave Morris and Oliver Johnson. Death of Fighting Fantasy a couple of years ago. He was the first guest author when Scholastic took over the license. We've got Russ Nicholson, the original artist on the Warlock of Fartup Mountain. He's being interviewed. And of course, I shouldn't. And guest of honour is Ian Livingstone himself, is going to be phoning in to have a chat with Ollie. So, as well as that, at about, I think it's 7 p.m, Ken Boyter of the Bottled Imp Fellowship is doing the fourth part. He's doing a live read-through of Beowulf Beast Slayer, actually. So it's part 4, and he's brought it forward to coincide with the date, so for Thursday. And then from 8 o'clock, there's a virtual Bureau, which is, the Bureaus are Fighting Fantasy fans or just general gamebook fans pub gatherings. But since the lockdown, they've gone online. So there's one that's occurring on International Gamebook Day. And I know that some publishers are doing, and authors are doing giveaways or discounts, they're doing sales. Branching Narrative, who did the video adventure game of Death Trap Dungeon, I think they're selling the game for 50% on the day. So yeah, it's every day there's new things being announced, which is fantastic. There was the Polish gamebook fans are doing their own linked event. There was a video already up from a guy in France, so it's quite exciting. Yeah.
Fantastic. No, it sounds good. It sounds like you've got a good lot of things happening, and I mean, when is it? It's 2 days away now, so. Yeah, it's great to see as well that there is a worldwide community of gamebook players, and it's fantastic. That's what started how many years ago now? 40 years ago now is still as popular now.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. Tell me this thing I always ask people. Usually they're game designers. I always ask them, "You're stuck in COVID. You're stuck locked down. What 3 games? Any games would you pick?" But because you're a game book writer, I'm going to vary it slightly and say, you can pick any 3 game books. What would be your top 3 game books that you had to read during the entire lockdown? You can use your own ones. That's fine.
That's a tricky one. I suppose.
The poor man's sitting there thinking,
I felt that.
Write them.
Yeah. Death Trap Dungeon. Yeah. Yeah. Death Trap Dungeon by Ian Livingstone is a classic for many reasons. I think the whole idea of, because one of the problems you have when writing a game book is generally you're one hero up against all these monsters or powerful wizards. Why would there only be one hero? So making it effectively a game show, it's a competition, made perfect sense. And it also explains why there's so many apex predators within such a small space. And on top of that, of course, so it had to be Death Trap Dungeon. Another of my favourite fighting fantasy game books is actually Dead of Night by Stephen Hand and Jim Bambra, illustrated by Martin McKenna. And when I read that, it gave me an idea of what else could be done with game books. So Martin, I've been fortunate to collaborate with Martin as well on several projects. But Stephen Hand particularly is a big influence on me as a game book author. And then for a third one, can I put one of my own in?
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Sounds incredibly vain, but the trouble is, because I've written so many books, I do forget them quite quickly because I'll be all absorbed with them for about a year and read them multiple times, and I won't look at them again. But Shadows over Sylvania was a lot of fun to write, and bizarrely, it's about 7 or 8 years old now. So to read that again, I would come to it with fresh eyes, and it's just the idea that you can be the vampire, so normally you're the bad guy. And you could also visit different places from the Warhammer world in all sorts of different orders. And depending on the route you took, it would change the midway encounters and things like that. So I was really pleased with the structure. And I think it just be quite a fun adventure to lose myself in.
Excellent.
Is that love for the vampire character one of the reasons you think that the Curse of the Vampire is one of your upcoming ACE titles, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Dracula's one I've steered away from for a long time, because whenever I saw any TV programs or films where they always go up against Dracula, I was like, oh, it's so unimaginative. And I quite liked Bram Stoker's Dracula when it came out, but it obviously varies from the original book in all sorts of ways. And several people said to me, why don't you do Dracula? Why don't you do Dracula? And for me, I have to have that different take on it. And I did read it years ago when I was at university, but I read it again, and you appreciate actually what an astounding piece of work it was. And although you could say that there's flaws with it from a modern reader's point of view, just the whole epistolary style, so it jumps between different characters. So that's what I've done in my adventure. So as with the other game books, some of my other ACE game books, you can play the adventure as a different character each time. With Dracula Curse of the Vampire, you can play as different characters, but you can swap during the course of the story. So there are bottleneck points where you can go from being Jonathan Harker stuck in Castle Dracula in Transylvania to being Mina Murray back in Whitby waiting for him. And that has an effect on the gameplay. You can play just as one character, but obviously if you change characters, it possibly means you might last longer because you've got a greater endurance score. But the downside is that you can do more things that attract Dracula's attention. So it swings around about, so it could make things harder for you at the end of the adventure. And also it's just bringing in other elements of Romanian legends and things like that, which Stoker was obviously influenced by himself. And then the final bit, which really did it for me, was I'm fascinated by the character of Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, as a historical figure. So it's hinted at in Dracula, that's who Dracula is. But in my book, it's explicit that that's who he is. So you can also play as Dracula, and that story starts back in the 15th century and comes through to the 19th century.
Nice. Also noticed another little tie-in with our sort of Monday to Friday, in that your Beowulf the Beast Slayer has a little tie-in with Otherworld Miniatures in a set that contains the miniature and Beowulf as well. So I feel obliged to track that down. But whilst I was also lightly skimming your life, because it's great what you can find on the internet. We don't really need to interview you. We can find out all we want to know about you online. But I have to say, I am drawn to have to checking out the Doll's House. We do you hear this for the catchline for it? The Doll's House. What horror dwells behind its peeling paint facade and its lifeless windows? that is worthy of Lovecraft.
That came about. I wrote it for an anthology several years ago called House of Fear, which is published by Solaris Books, edited by John Oliver. And I think the year before, he commissioned a series of horror stories based on basically Underground, which is called End of the Line. And I thought that would be a fantastic subject for a horror story. And I said, John, if you're doing any more anthologies, let me know. So the next one came and said, John, would you like to contribute? Yeah, fantastic. What's the theme? Haunted houses. And I was like, oh, no. And then I thought, Alec, just mould it over. And my parents-in-law used to have an old doll's house in what was the playroom of their house on a table. And my kids played with it. But just the way it sat there, the sort of presence at the bottom of the stairs, and it kind of all stemmed from that. And I remember it was a real struggle to write the story at first, because I think I put some tweet up saying I'm really struggling to write my current short story because A, it's set in the present day, and B, it's a ghost story, but it's not a ghost story. And it took a lot of work, but I'm really pleased with how it went. And it has a very dark ending, which when I did a book signing, one of the other authors welcomed me by saying, you're Johnathan Green, the man who, and then I won't say any more.
Yes.
So that's quite interesting.
I did say that, yes, so we're interviewed a very dark character tonight, just earlier on, because one only has to lightly skim your biography to discover that you're quite a dark character, really. But that's a good thing to us. We're not saying that in the criticism. Sorry, I jumped in there. I interrupted Justin's flow yet again.
No, it's grand. I will say, I have actually met him in well-lit convention centres, Andy. He's not that dark.
That's okay.
Take nothing from this, that the lights are off behind him and he's sitting in the dark.
I'm still planning on actually shutting down my computer tonight and unplugging it from the wall, just in case.
Exercise, yeah.
So, Johnathan, one thing you did mention as well, through your vast catalogue of everything you worked on, was Doctor Who. So, tell us a wee bit about what you've done with Doctor Who.
Yep, so I've written 2 game books, most of an annual, a quiz book, and a novel for children. So, the first one came about during David Tennant's tenure as the 10th Doctor. It must have been about 2008, something like that, I think it was. And I saw that Puffin Books are publishing Decide Your Destiny, which are more like the Choose Your Own Adventure. So there are no game stats, very basic branching narratives. And I read a couple and I thought, I could do this. So I emailed the editor, who I didn't know. And this is just one of those cases where meeting the right person at the right time makes all the difference, because obviously I had a track record, so I could say I've written game books before. But she was also an editor who was very open to trying new writers. So giving people an opportunity. So she asked me to do a writing sample, I think it was, but also had to pitch about 4 different ideas. And from those 4, one they didn't like, one was too close to something that was in development for the TV series, and then they had 2, and it was pretty much a case of, well, which one do you want to write? So I settled on what became The Horror of Howling Hill, which is actually another Beowulf influenced story. And Sutton Hoo Helmet and all sorts of things come into it. And some of the places like Long Barrows in Wiltshire, where I grew up exploring. And then I'm trying to think what order it came next. So then it was the annual. So I ended up writing, I think, about half the 2010 annual. So all sorts of things, from fact files about characters to crosswords and word searches and other things. And then when it became the 11th Doctor, they were looking for some. It was a series. They sort of publish these books back to back. So they'd have 2 stories in them, and you turn the cover over, and it'd be a different cover on the other side. So I had one with Gary Russell, and they were packaged as monstrous missions. But mine was a story called Terrible Lizards, which was originally pitched as Blackbeard the pirate meets dinosaurs in the Everglades. But I didn't know at the time, but they had a pirate story coming up, The Curse of the Black Spot, whatever it was. So that had to go. So instead it became Victorian explorers. So it's on a tramp steamer, and I called it The Venture. So it's effectively the characters from King Kong find dinosaurs in the Everglades. So the rest of it stayed the same. But that was eventually published again as its own book. And then when it was the 12th Doctor, they were looking at starting a new line of game books, and they asked me to write the first one, which is called Choose the Future. So Decide Your Destiny, the reader, just like traditional game books, was the hero of the story. So the tricky thing with that was you meet the Doctor, you meet Martha, but then you have to get them away from the Doctor, because otherwise, surely you do what the Doctor tells you to do. So you had to kind of have the chance to make the wrong choices. But the difference with Choose the Future was that you were the Doctor and you had to make the decisions for him. So it's kind of written as if you're an omniscient observer. So you hear what the Doctor's saying and what he's doing, but then you still get to say, well, he should go here, he should do that. So again, it was a similar sort of choose your adventure, but I put in a little mechanic where if you follow a trail of clues, you get a completely different reason for the monsters in the story. And that was called Night of the Kraken. So you can see there's familiar things which I keep coming back to in my adventures. But I also wrote in that interim Time Lord Quiz Quest, I think it was called in the end, which is another book of puzzles. But nothing for the 13th Doctor yet. But I have asked.
There's still time. Still time.
Yes.
All right.
Hey.
That was embarrassing even for me.
You've been waiting all night to say that.
Not a long time. I have to ask you, I mean, I know you've mentioned you've done the couple of game books for 40k as well. And you know, for no particular reason. You've also written some Warhammer straight up novels. Is this not correct? Because I very quickly cast an eye across my bookcase, and at least one of them, for once, I've actually read back in Mr. Time, and I know I must have liked it because it's still in the book.
That's good.
If I've got this list right, Necromancer, Mage Storm, The Dead and the Damned, and guess which one I read? Iron Hands.
Iron Hands, yeah.
Now, you know, I'm going to put you in the spot. Was this just a case of, I really like eating and paying my rent? Yes, I'll write a book for you. Or was it kind of like, ooh, Games Workshop, Warhammer, you say? Why, I quite like that. I'd love to write a book for you.
It started out because when I left university, so by this point I'd had, I'm trying to think where I got to, I'd had 3 books commissioned. So by the time I left uni, I'd written 2 and I had a 3rd one lined up for Fighting Fantasy. Mark Gascoigne was the consultant editor, and he had worked at Games Workshop. He would return there later. And he was very good friends of Jervis Johnson, who's still at the company. I think he's the longest serving member of staff or something. But Jervis worked on designing the army books, the codexes, fiction writing skills, text for the army books. And I moved to Nottingham on leaving university to try and be a freelance writer. So as well as writing fighters, writing colour text for Games Workshop. So they gave me a test piece, I think. It was the first stuff I did for them was for the old Warhammer Armies Dark Elves book. And it ended up that pretty much any codex they had coming out or army book, I would write the short stories for it. So I did the Wood Elves, I did Angels of Death. So I wrote the background section on Lionel Johnston. What else did I do? I did some work for Epic 40k. I'm sure there's others I've forgotten now. Codex Chaos, I did that one as well. And while I was there, they set up the Black Library for the first time, and they set up Inferno Magazine, which was the short story magazine to bring in new talent and authors. So I was present for some of the very early meetings where they were discussing what it was going to be called with Andy Jones and Mark Gascoigne. And from that, I wrote a story for the very first issue, which was, I'm trying to think what it was called now. It's an Ultramarine story. And Salvation, that was it. Ultramarines versus Gene Stealers. And once they were launching it, they were doing a special issue 0 in White Dwarf magazine, and I wrote a Warhammer story for that called The Hounds of Winter. And it just stemmed from there. So I kept writing pieces for Inferno. And then as they produced the novels, I got my chance to pitch for that. And the first novel isn't really a novel; it's a short story collection. So The Dead and the Damned was a combining some of the stories I'd written for Inferno plus a whole load of others using the same characters, and they were a bunch of Kislevite bounty hunters and mercenaries. So having done that, they then asked me to do a 40k novel. So I wrote Crusade for Armageddon, and it kind of alternated then between Warhammer and 40k. So like you say, I did Maidstone, which was tied into the Storm of Chaos campaign. I also did Iron Hands, as you say, Necromancer, and Conquest of Armageddon. There was meant to be a trilogy of them, but the third one never happened. Oh. So yeah, I've written six novels altogether, and I've lost track of how many short stories for them now. It's probably about 15 or 16, and that doesn't include the colour text, obviously. So I'm doing some for them again. So the last one published was Journey of the Magi, which is Thousand Suns exploring a Necron artificial planetoid. I've got a story coming up, I think I can mention this, in the new Necromunda Uprising anthology. And I've also written some Age of Sigmar stuff, which isn't out yet.
Class. So it's suffice to say, judging by your efficiency with the both the recall and the names, there's a little bit of fandom in there. It's not just a paid gig for you.
Sorry, I didn't get that, but you cut up then, sorry.
Sorry, I'm guessing by the accuracy in the names, as well as the very remarkable recall on those stories, that there's a little bit of fandom in there, not just a paid gig.
Well, yeah, before I worked for Games Workshop, I hadn't played Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but a cousin of mine had it, and I remember I loved poring over the books, things like Death on the Reich. And when I did start working for them, I immersed myself in all this background, and it was fantastic. And I sometimes like to think that Games Workshop is my hobby, because obviously my hobby was writing, but it's my job. And I do things with my family. We like to travel. We like to visit castles and things like that. But I'd like to think that Games Workshop's still my hobby, and as much of that is just immersing myself in the lore. So I've always bought White Dwarf magazine. I've always read Black Library novels anyway, and I still do. Dan Abnett, I'm sure everybody loves Dan Abnett, but he's the writer I want to be, because he is so prolific and writes for so many different things. So that's who I aspire to be. But yeah, so I'm always intrigued. I was looking at the newsletter today that's been sent with the new Warcry warbands, which look amazing. So yes, I love the whole imagery of it, the setting, the artwork is fantastic. The miniatures are beautiful, and it's just a lot of fun to play with those toys from time to time.
Yes.
Well, Jonathan, this is when we surprise you, and Andy brings Dan Abnett into the call.
Well, he's recently had his appendix out, so I doubt it.
Well, I was just going to say, I've read a few of his books too, but it's still Iron Hands. It's on the shelf, not on Dan Abnett. Anyway, moving on.
That was my fanboy moment then, you see.
That's okay. I'll tell you, whenever we bring Dan on for an interview, we'll make a point of dropping your name and how you should really think about doing a collaboration with you, because you and he could write a game book together. That'd
be good.
Yeah.
That'd be fun, yeah.
There you go. Yes. I'll ring you back later, Dan. Sorry, that was my question. Again, I just dive in randomly from the sideline. Sorry, Justin, I'll shut up.
Right. Not a problem. Well, listen, we have covered quite a bit, and I think it's only fair to sort of give you a bit of time now to sort of promote your event again. Just sort of jump in there, tell us what you can, and just sort of plug your books. Go for it. We'll stick links and everything up in this as well. Okay. But just advertise yourself.
No. That's a terrible way to do it. The proper and professional way to do it is that, of course, Thursday, the 27th, is International Game Book Day. Jonathan, what are you most hoping is going to come out of that event?
There you go.
Really just that to bring kind of the it sounds such a cliche. It's like Miss World or something, world peace and friendship, but to bring that community together, because there are really active gamebook groups all over the world, and I've discovered this more and more thanks to social media, but also I'm fortunate in that my ACE Gamebooks are now being published in various different languages. There are some out already, but there are more to come. And for example, 2 years ago, I went to Frankfurt Book Fair with Manticore Verlag, who publish my books in Germany. And just to see the hordes of people there, and people like Sven Harder, who are writing, he wrote Ride of the Black Sun, and he's got Heavy Metal Heroes, and he's bringing out an English version of that soon. And it's really active, and it's seen as something for adults. It's not saying necessarily for kids. And that's the thing. I don't know why. Well, we could probably discuss this for hours, but in the UK, it was always seen as something for children, and they're still marketed that way, certainly by the big publishers. And yet, I like to think it's, because another thing I love is 2000 AD. So I like to think it's rather like that, in that it's an all ages thing. So you can have adults read them and enjoy them just as much as children. Some children, when I read them, I didn't know half the words, and it made me look at what esoteric meant and arcane, and what's a demon and what's an elemental. And then as an adult, you get all these other references, and you appreciate the dark humor and the tricks in the writing and the in-jokes and things like that, and just the atmosphere in some of the books. So it's really that the international community feeds into each other and what's around, and maybe give people the opportunity to read them in another language, and maybe people think about translating them, and just really sharing our love of all things interactive and fictional.
It's lovely.
And maybe get a few book sales too.
You get a few book sales too. No, it's lovely from our point of view, because obviously as the wee gamers, we are all about people playing games together. And the more people play together and come together as friends and families, it's fantastic. But the beautiful thing about this is that, the game books are really a game you play on your own. It's like a solo board game.
Yes.
But the fact that it has its community that still comes together and still supports each other and shares with each other is just another lovely facet. It's still a part of the hobby, and that's just beautiful. And we love to thank you as well.
Good.
So from your own pen, then, from your own font of wisdom, what can fans, old and new, expect in the next sort of 6 to 12 months from the printing press of Johnathan Green? What should they be looking out for?
See, that's the trick. Well, obviously, Dracula, Curse of the Vampire comes out hopefully in spring next year. Obviously, COVID allowing, with all the different things, because we had delays on various things with printers and manufacturers and all the rest of it. But that's the plan anyway. It's to be out in the spring. Beyond that, I've got loads of things on my slate, but probably nothing I can talk about yet. But I've got another couple of gamebook projects lined up, one of which is tied to an existing brand. That's all I'll say. Yeah, more short stories, hopefully more role-playing games. I'd like to turn some of my other ACE Gamebook properties into role-playing games, and I've been talking to some people about collaborating to do that. Several people seem interested in there being a Beowulf one, and I've got an idea for that. But I'd also like to turn Neverland Here Be Monsters into a setting for maybe something like Savage Worlds. I think that could work really well. Yep. So, yeah, I'm being a bit cagey, but it's one of those things where I know what I've got to write, but ask me this time next year and I'll probably be able to tell you loads of different things. But obviously, you've not read the ACE Gamebook series yet. There's always those. There's 5 of those before we get to Dracula.
Yeah, but the trouble is that this time next year, our final question will be, so in the next 6 to 12 months, what can your fans expect from you? And we'll just get the same stupid answer. No, that's fair enough. Well, you're not going to give away.
Well, I will say that I would like to write an updated edition of You Are the Hero for Fighting Fantasy's 40th anniversary in 2022. And it would be different from the other 2 titles so far, because as well as carrying on up to 2022, it would be written as an interactive book itself. So you'd be turning backwards and forwards through the history of the Gamebook series.
Okay. Right.
There you go. You heard it here first.
We heard it here first. For our final, then, I can always adapt my final question, which I usually use for board gamers and role-playing creators, because you fall very much into the same category. You're essentially writing role-playing games. So it is the end times, and the entity which is bringing it about has circled out you for particular attention and has decided that despite wanting to rend all of reality apart, it's got a bit of a soft spot for you. It also likes Iron Hands. So it has decided that instead of you being snapped into non-existence, it's going to allow you to be immersed into one of your own books. Which of your own books would you choose to be entombed in for all time, and why?
Wow. That's tricky.
Yes,
Oh,
there's no point if it's an easy question like, what did you have for your tea? Nobody cares.
It's a funny one because I'm not writing any more Pax Britannia at the moment, but it would probably have to be one of those. Maybe the original one, Unnatural History, because you've got this character performing Daring Do. There's dinosaurs in London Zoo. You can travel to cities under the sea and on the moon. There's vampires and werewolves. You can go hunting in Central Europe. I mean, what's not to love?
Fair enough. Yeah. You picked the nicest of your book worlds to move into. You're wise. You picked the one where page 22 does not end in your death.
That's true. That is true.
Very good. Well, I'm satisfied.
Well, yes, everything we've heard tonight's been great, and it's been great speaking to you. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, we'd like to have you back in the future sometime, and just keep us updated on what else is coming out, and let us know everything else that's coming out when it comes out, and touch base with us again in the future.
I've added him.
Great, I will.
I've added him to the calendar for this time next year. That's what he said. He said, "Speak to me this time next year." So I've put it in. Was that not what he meant? No, I take things very literally.
Excellent. I know I'm going to be checking out everything that's going on with International Gamebook Day. I'm going to be popping in and out during the day as well, and I'm looking forward to that. I really am. Andy, anything to leave us with there?
Yes, International Gamebook Day. When you join in, remember that the only way you can use your thumbs is on your phone to go between the different videos and events. You can actually save what you're there and then flick back to it, because it's the internet, not paper.
Yeah.
The public service announcement. I like to think I'm useful.
You turned the video, you win.
That's it. Well, folks, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to Johnathan. It's been tolerable as always listening to Justin. It's been it's been an absolute blessing having me in your lives. I know. But until next time, it's goodbye from the two of them, and it's goodbye from me as well. Goodbye.
Eminem.
Bye.